On September 3, 2019, tech executive Michael Chen stood before 200 wedding guests and made an announcement that would haunt him for years. The wedding was off. His reason? Career ambitions that couldn't wait. His bride, Sarah Kim, left that venue humiliated but determined. 5 years later, Michael would walk into a boardroom to meet his new CEO after a hostile takeover. When Sarah Kim turned around in that executive chair, his world collapsed. This is the story of how ruthless ambition created its own downfall and how one woman's calculated revenge became Silicon Valley's most shocking corporate takeover. Chapter 1. The Cancellation. September 3, 2019, was supposed to be the happiest day of Sarah Kim's life. The Rosewood Manor in Menlo Park had been transformed into a vision of elegance. 200 guests had gathered, tech executives mingling with family members, venture capitalists seated alongside college friends. The wedding that would unite two of Silicon Valley's rising stars was set to begin at 4 o'clock. But at 3:45, Michael Chen was not in his dressing room adjusting his bow tie. He was in the parking lot, on a conference call with investors in Shanghai. His best man found him pacing between luxury cars, gesturing wildly as he discussed market penetration strategies and quarterly projections. When reminded that his wedding would begin in 15 minutes, Michael did something that would become Silicon Valley legend. He ended the call, walked into the venue, and announced the wedding was off. The scene that followed was surreal. Michael stood at the altar, not as a groom, but as a CEO delivering a presentation. He explained to the stunned audience that he had received an opportunity that he couldn't wait for. His startup, Next, had just secured a potential partnership with a major Chinese conglomerate, but it required his immediate and complete focus. Marriage, he stated with corporate coldness, would be a distraction he couldn't afford at this critical juncture. Sarah stood frozen in the bridal suite, watching through a window as her life unraveled in real time. Her maid of honor would later describe the moment Sarah's expression changed from shock to something harder, more calculating. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply removed her veil, set it carefully on the dresser, and asked for her phone. The humiliation was public and complete. Tech blogs picked up the story within hours. Startup founder chooses code over vows, read one headline. Another called it the most Silicon Valley wedding cancellation ever. The narrative painted Michael as the ruthless genius, too focused on innovation to be distracted by personal commitments. Sarah became a footnote, the jilted bride who couldn't compete with an algorithm. But those who knew Sarah understood this was a miscalculation. She had graduated from Stanford Business School with distinction. She had already turned down offers from 3 major firms to support Michael's dreams, planning to launch her own consultancy after their honeymoon. The wedding cancellation didn't just end a relationship. It severed her from a network she had helped Michael build, the connection she had facilitated, and the investor she had charmed at countless dinners. Michael's reasoning was ruthlessly logical, at least in his mind. Next was developing revolutionary predictive analytics software. The Chinese partnership would provide access to massive data sets and a billion-user market. Every day of delay meant competitors could close the gap. In his calculation, Sarah would understand. They could reschedule the wedding once the deal was secured. Love was patient, markets were not. What Michael failed to calculate was the cost of humiliation in an industry built on reputation. Several investors who attended the wedding quietly withdrew from future funding rounds. His treatment of Sarah became a warning sign about his character, whispered about in venture capital offices. But in those first months, Michael was too intoxicated by initial success to notice the subtle shift in how people looked at him. Sarah disappeared from the tech scene entirely. She deleted her social media, declined all interviews, and moved out of the Bay Area apartment she had shared with Michael. Friends received only brief messages saying she needed time to reconsider her path. Most assumed she had left Silicon Valley altogether, another casualty of the industry's relentless appetite for sacrifice. Michael, meanwhile, threw himself into Next with manic intensity. 18-hour days became 20-hour marathons. He slept in the office, lived on energy drinks and protein bars, and spoke about his company with religious fervor. The partnership with China proceeded. The technology has advanced. The valuation grew. But in her absence, Sarah Kim was planning something far more sophisticated than a simple return. Chapter 2. The Rise. While Michael Chen celebrated his first million-dollar quarter at Next, Sarah Kim was sitting in a small office in Palo Alto, studying every merger and acquisition that had occurred in Silicon Valley over the past decade. She wasn't healing from heartbreak. She was studying warfare. Corporate warfare, to be precise. Her transformation began 3 weeks after the canceled wedding. Instead of retreating from the tech world, Sarah enrolled in an advanced corporate strategy program at Wharton, commuting from California to Philadelphia every week. Her professors would later describe her as the most focused student they had ever encountered. She wasn't there to network or pad her resume. She was there to learn how to dismantle companies from the inside out. By early 2020, Sarah had quietly returned to Silicon Valley, but not in any way Michael or his circle would notice. She took a position at Aperture Capital, a boutique investment firm known for aggressive acquisition strategies. Her starting role was deliberately modest, junior analyst, the kind of position that kept her name off press releases and out-of-industry newsletters. But within 6 months, she had identified 3 undervalued startups that Aperture acquired and flipped for a combined profit of $47 million. Her approach was methodical and patient. While Michael built Next through flash and publicity, Sarah built her reputation through whispers and results. She attended different conferences, cultivated different networks, and most importantly, she studied Next's every move. She knew their burn rate, their investor pool, their technical weaknesses, and their contractual vulnerabilities. She tracked Michael's mistakes like a scientist documenting experimental failures. Michael, intoxicated by his rising valuation, never noticed the careful intelligence gathering happening around him. By mid-2020, Next had reached a $100 million valuation. The Chinese partnership had exceeded projections. Michael was featured on the cover of 3 tech magazines, always with the same confident smirk, always with quotes about sacrificing everything for success. In one particularly tone-deaf interview, he mentioned that canceling his wedding was the best business decision he had ever made. The quote would later haunt him in ways he couldn't imagine. Sarah read that interview in her Aperture Capital office. Her assistant would later testify that she saw Sarah circle the quote 3 times with a red pen, then file it in a folder marked leverage. By this point, Sarah had been promoted to senior strategist and was managing her own acquisition targets. But her real work happened after hours, building a shadow network of Michael's former employees, disappointed investors, and competing firms. The genius of Sarah's strategy lay in its invisibility. She never directly competed with Next. Instead, she positioned herself as a solution to the problems Michael was creating. When Next's aggressive expansion alienated smaller partners, Sarah's firm quietly acquired those partners. When Michael's management style drove away top talent, Sarah recruited them for her portfolio companies. She was building a constellation of resources around Next, though Michael remained oblivious to the pattern. By late 2021, Sarah had orchestrated her promotion to managing director at Aperture Capital. The firm gave her unprecedented autonomy to pursue a major acquisition target. Everyone assumed she was going after one of the struggling video streaming platforms, or perhaps a cybersecurity firm. Nobody suspected she had spent 2 years preparing to acquire her ex-fiancé's company. Michael's arrogance had grown proportional to his success. He burned through CTOs, alienated board members, and made increasingly risky bets on expansion. His belief in his own genius had become absolute. When employees raised concerns about company culture or strategic direction, he dismissed them with the same cold logic he had used to cancel his wedding. Success, he believed, validated everything. But success in Silicon Valley is often built on borrowed time and borrowed money. Next's aggressive expansion required constant capital injection. Michael had given up significant equity with each funding round, believing future growth would compensate for the dilution. By early 2022, he owned less than 20% of his own company, though he maintained control through specialized voting shares. Sarah understood the mathematics of Michael's hubris. She knew exactly how much pressure would cause his carefully constructed empire to crack. She had spent 3 years building the tools she would need, accumulating the capital, the allies, and most importantly, the information. The stage was set for one of Silicon Valley's most calculated corporate takedowns. Chapter 3. The Acquisition. The takeover of Next began not with a hostile bid, but with a seemingly innocent investment proposal in January 2022. Aperture Capital, through a subsidiary shell company called Vertex Holdings, offered to participate in Next Series C funding round. Michael Chen, desperate for capital to fund his Asian expansion, didn't scrutinize the offer as carefully as he should have. He needed $70 million. Vertex offered $80 million. Sarah Kim had structured the investment through 3 layers of corporate entities, making her involvement completely invisible. She had learned from the best corporate raiders in history that the most effective attacks come from angles the target never expects. While Michael focused on the generous terms and the prestigious additions to his cap table, he missed the poison pills hidden in the fine print. The provisions seemed standard at first glance. Board observation rights, anti-dilution clauses, and information access requirements. But Sarah had spent months crafting language that would give her extraordinary power under specific circumstances. If Next missed certain performance metrics, Vertex Holdings could convert its preferred shares to common stock at a favorable ratio. If key employees departed, Vertex gained additional board nomination rights. If the company's valuation dropped below specific thresholds, Vertex could call for an independent audit. By March 2022, Sarah began executing Phase 2. Using her network of former Next employees, she orchestrated what appeared to be a series of unfortunate coincidences. The lead engineer received a better offer from a competitor. The head of sales discovered discrepancies in Michael's revenue projections. 3 board members began asking uncomfortable questions about corporate governance. Each incident alone seemed manageable, but together they created a pattern of instability. Michael's response was predictably aggressive. He accused departing employees of disloyalty, threatened legal action against competitors, and attempted to consolidate power by restructuring the board. Every move he made to protect his position actually weakened it further. His paranoia and micromanagement accelerated the brain drain from Next, and by May 2022, the company had lost 40% of its senior technical staff. The death blow came through a whistleblower complaint filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The complaint, submitted anonymously, detailed accounting irregularities in Next Chinese partnership. The allegations weren't criminal, but they were embarrassing enough to trigger an internal audit. During the audit, more questionable practices emerged. Revenue recognition issues, inflated user metrics, and misleading investor communications. Again, nothing explicitly illegal, but enough to spook investors. Next's valuation plummeted from $300 million to $90 million in 6 weeks. The triggers Sarah had embedded in the Vertex Holdings investment agreement activated like dominoes falling in sequence. Suddenly, Vertex controlled 41% of the company's common stock and had the right to nominate 4 of 7 board members. Michael's specialized voting shares, which had protected his control, were nullified by provisions he had signed without fully understanding. The special board meeting was called for June 15, 2022, at Next headquarters. Michael arrived expecting to fight off a standard hostile takeover attempt. He had prepared presentations, lined up loyal board members, and even hired a crisis management firm. He was ready for corporate combat with Vertex Holdings, the faceless entity that had invaded his company. But when he entered the boardroom, Sarah Kim was already sitting at the table. The security footage from that day would later be leaked to TechCrunch, showing Michael's face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally, devastating comprehension. Sarah didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply slid a folder across the table containing Aperture Capital's acquisition offer for Next. The folder also contained a printed copy of Michael's interview, where he called canceling their wedding his best business decision, with one handwritten note: My turn. The board vote was swift and unanimous. Even Michael's supposed allies recognized that Sarah's offer was the only path forward for the company. She hadn't just engineered a takeover. She had made herself the only possible savior for a company she had deliberately pushed to the brink of collapse. Michael's attempt to speak was cut short by corporate procedure. As the founder but minority shareholder, he could observe but not influence the decision. The man who had stood at an altar 3 years earlier, explaining why his company mattered more than marriage, now sat in silence, as that same company was stripped from his control. Sarah Kim was named interim CEO of NeuralNext effective immediately. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. Sarah Kim's first day as CEO of NeuralNext was orchestrated with surgical precision. She arrived at 6:30 in the morning, 2 hours before Michael typically showed up, and systematically claimed every symbol of power in the building. His personal effects were professionally packed and waiting in the lobby. The executive floor was reorganized. Even the company's internal messaging system reflected the change, with automated emails announcing the leadership transition sent to all employees, partners, and investors simultaneously. Michael Chen discovered his access badge no longer worked when he arrived at 8:45. The security guard, clearly uncomfortable, handed him a termination package that Sarah had personally prepared. Inside was a severance agreement, generous by industry standards, but with one devastating condition: a complete non-compete clause that would bar him from working in predictive analytics, artificial intelligence, or any related field for 5 years. If he refused to sign, Sarah had documented enough corporate governance failures to pursue legal action that could result in criminal charges. The business media erupted with the story. The wedding revenge. Silicon Valley's most personal hostile takeover became the most read article in TechCrunch history. Industry analysts dissected every move Sarah had made, tracing back 3 years of strategic positioning. Several business schools would later add the NeuralNext acquisition to their curriculum as a masterclass in corporate warfare. But Sarah's revenge extended beyond simply taking Michael's company. Her first executive decision was to cancel the Chinese partnership that Michael had chosen over their marriage. She revealed that her due diligence had uncovered significant legal and ethical concerns about data privacy that Michael had ignored in his pursuit of growth. The cancellation was portrayed as responsible leadership, protecting the company from future liability. The subtext was clear. The deal Michael had sacrificed everything for was not only unnecessary, but dangerous. Michael's attempts to fight back were swift but futile. He tried to rally former employees, but Sarah had already promoted or compensated anyone whose loyalty might waver. He attempted to launch a competing startup, but the non-compete clause she had crafted was airtight. He sought media sympathy, but the same publications that had once celebrated his ruthlessness now portrayed him as a cautionary tale about karma in Silicon Valley. The most devastating blow came when Sarah released NeuralNext's internal communications from Michael's tenure as CEO. Without violating any privacy laws, she selectively shared emails and messages that revealed his management style, his dismissive attitude toward employees, and most damningly, messages from the week of their canceled wedding where he had laughed about the situation with investors. Public opinion, which might have eventually sympathized with him, turned permanently hostile. Under Sarah's leadership, NeuralNext underwent a complete transformation. She implemented the employee-first culture that Michael had mocked as inefficient. She prioritized sustainable growth over aggressive expansion. Most surprisingly, she turned the company profitable within 6 months, something Michael had promised but never delivered in 4 years. The industry watched in amazement as the company Michael had nearly destroyed flourished under the leadership of the woman he had humiliated. By December 2023, NeuralNext's valuation had exceeded $500 million. Sarah had restored employee morale, secured ethical partnerships, and positioned the company as a leader in responsible AI development. She gave interviews sparingly, but when asked about the acquisition, she would simply state that she saw an undervalued asset and acted accordingly. She never mentioned Michael by name. Michael Chen, meanwhile, had become a ghost in Silicon Valley. His wealth from a forced sale was substantial, but his reputation was destroyed. He relocated to Austin, attempted to reinvent himself in cryptocurrency, and failed spectacularly. Former colleagues reported seeing him at industry events, standing alone at the edges of conversations, a living reminder of the cost of placing ambition above humanity. The final irony came in September 2024, exactly 5 years after the canceled wedding. Sarah Kim announced Neuralnex's IPO with an initial valuation of $2 billion. On the same day, Michael's non-compete agreement expired, but the industry had moved on. The technologies he understood were outdated. The connections he had cultivated wouldn't return his calls. Sarah Kim had not just taken his company, she had made him irrelevant. The man who had stood at an altar declaring that marriage would distract from success had learned that some distractions become destinations, and some victories cost more than defeat ever could. Sarah Kim's calculated revenge reminds us that in Silicon Valley, karma sometimes comes with a hostile takeover clause. If this story of ambition and retribution captivated you, subscribe for more tales of power, betrayal, and corporate justice.